Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me. I'm delighted to be here in Seoul, and how wonderful the timing of being here. So many things are happening. I really appreciated former Secretary of UN Ban Ki-moon's speech on highlighting the idea of AI. As all presentations, I prepared my presentation and then really wanted to change it because of how fast technology is changing. So, if I may, the title of my talk is on Unmanned Systems and Private Maritime Security Companies. I've attempted something rather ambitious in 12 minutes, or less ideally, in combining two very separate, what I call variables, but trying to combine it together to provide a more holistic approach. So by way of background, I call myself a legal futurist. What do I do? In my past life, I was a litigator. I fight cases in court, but I appreciated that there are bigger things to do. In other words, to sit and think about what possible legal questions might we need to encounter and what we need to face. So there are some key terms that I've highlighted there that I guess are trigger points for maybe some of you, be it in the Navy or as a ship owner or as a legal counsel that you might want to consider. So they include private maritime, PMSEs for short word, unmanned systems, underwater defense, and in a previous conference that I attended, which I think is also relevant to our topic here, which is the uncertainties of international law, is the notion of optimizing constants by maximizing variables. I had a conference call this morning and someone gave me a similar, rather different quote, which is, the only constant thing right now is the consistency of exponential technology. Which, if you think about it as a contradictory of terms, what is consistent but exponential? And I feel that these are the times that we're living. What we feel are constant changes that we, as an organization, as individuals, need to be prepared. Yes, that includes lawyers. So I ask these questions in your work. What are the things that are constant for you? What are the things that you would think about you could maximize in? And what are the variables? So you will see throughout my talk that these questions that I ask are relevant when we look at the variable components. So this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So let's start with the basic legal framework. What do we have? I always tell people when I come to these kind of talks, particularly with non-lawyers, is law is a tool that we use in our toolkit, particularly for politicians. It's not the be-all and end-all because we have politics, we have economics, we have socio-economic factors, other things that are also important, not just the law. But the law provides us tools to use as a way to negotiate, a way to get out or get into a situation. So I've highlighted a few things which I'm sure you're all familiar with: UNCLOS, COLREGs, and also the structure of institutions, ICJ, ICC, Permanent Court of Arbitration. And I've also put in two manuals, the San Remo manual, and also the Tallinn Cybersecurity Manual, which I'm sure, as you may know, is a huge topic within the shipping industry right now. Again, I don't need to go through the legal framework, but simply just to highlight, when we talk about unmanned systems, it's important to distinguish what is a ship and what is identified as a warship as well. And I guess one of the things, or one of the stories I'll bring out is, as you may recall, a recent incident between the Chinese and the Americans, where the Chinese picked up an unmanned drone. And of course, there was a whole discussion going, well, it's ours. And, you know, I have a personal view on this, but I'll explain that a bit later. Again, just illustrating how the laws come about, the idea of obligations and impact assessments, as we've heard so often since the last two sessions as well. Now I'm going to move on to unmanned vessels, and then I'm going to talk about PMSCs. So there are so many variable terms. We've got unmanned maritime vessels, surface vessels. I have to say I've been working on this for the last 5 years, and I'm delighted to say that about probably a month or two ago, probably a bit more than 2 months ago, the IMO finally passed through a piece of document as I think to set up a working group to actually look at smart shipping, because this is what it's all about. It's actually about autonomous ships at sea. And I started off working on this, as I said, 5 years ago, as one of the only 2 lawyers in what was set up as a Mars working group in London. Now there are over about 70 of us, not just lawyers, but stakeholders, governments, people from the military, naval, you name it. And I'm just so delighted that there's movement in this. But I can tell you right now, the law is not fast enough. What is it all about? Well, if you think about it, when there was the Sewell case, the first thing, my understanding, was the Coast Guard contacted the Americans and said, we need some unmanned vessels. We need to see if there are any survivors. We need to know what's down there. And I think, apart from saving lives, unmanned systems can provide for so many things. Scientific research, law enforcement, deep sea mining, which is a huge topic right now as well. Ensuring safety of sub-cable lines and so forth. Now, this diagram is actually quite well known, particularly I got this from the Unmanned project, which is one of the EU-funded projects, the first ones to actually look at autonomous shipping and the labeling of different levels of autonomy. I've worked on a project which has 7 levels. I think Lloyd's also introduced different levels of autonomy. I forget whether it's 6 or 7, but anyway, it's up for discussion. But very simply, to simplify it, you have a manned ship, traditional way of shipping, then you have a remote ship, which is basically by remote control, let's say, an automated ship, which again is one step further removed, and then you have the autonomous ship, which is basically the climax of autonomy, which is, in essence, a smart ship, no man involved. So what matters for us as lawyers is to think about, well, right now, all this discussion about AI, about Google cars, about drones, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is how do we avoid a collision? So it's an interesting discussion that we have, because can this unmanned vessel satisfy international law when it comes to collision? Of course, you've got laws of giving way, of avoiding head-on collisions, of having, full view. And currently, there are a lot of discussions on that. So if we bear that in mind, I now move on to PMSCs. Now, some of my colleagues here today may be talking to you about piracy, but as you all know, the fact that PMSCs became famous was because back in 2008, the peak of piracy in the Gulf of Aden meant that ship owners needed to protect their shipment, protect their men and women that were seafarers at the high seas. So the phenomenon came that these who were maybe previously private military security companies had business at high seas. And we saw their role grow, we saw international standards develop, and we saw the international community actually developing. And I have a great Japanese professor friend here who's also helped me in my research. But this idea that who they are now is no longer a question of whether they're legitimate or not. They have a role to play, and countries have passed laws to enable them to do the job that they need to do. And these are just some of an outline of the laws that are available, and I'm happy to share the slides, which I believe you will also have, that highlights what allows them to do what they are currently doing. Now, I've sort of made an indication that these unmanned systems can go up on top of seas, but also underwater as well. So I use underwater as a simple example of things that we need to consider when we talk about maritime security, because it's so easy. You can imagine for collision to occur and the consequences that will flow through, the inquiries that will be made. But in essence, all these variables, including the law, have to be taken into account. Design, awareness, education, retraining, you name it. So what are the potential scenarios? Now, if we go for a moment from unmanned ship, and then this notion of using PMSCs after piracy being subcontracted to work on these unmanned ships. In other words, be it you're a state, be it you're a ship owner, and you want to hire someone to deal with this. But what is our biggest fear right now? Cybersecurity, right? Anything that gets hacked right now is beyond your control. In fact, once it's hacked and you're trying to fix it, it's too late, because there's already a virus, there's already malfunction, and hacking is not that difficult. You can just basically, I think you spam the ship to believe they've reached its destination. Or you just basically, not disarm, but basically you stop it from its tracks. It's going to cost money. You can imagine ship owners' lines have a timetable, and the moment they're not moving, there is money to be lost. So these are the kind of things that that I think is important for us to think about, because it's pretty hard. So I kind of wanted to go lead a bit further and to also touch upon public international law. At what point when a merchant vessel actually becomes military? And I think it's an interesting topic because, we look at the South China Sea and there's all sorts of connotations to that. But for instance, when is a fisherman not a fisherman sort of argument? But these are the kind of points that I sort of highlight in such scenarios where, for example, they're a suspect, or for navies to consider, whether they are genuinely or not, hostile. And I think here, for example, the contribution to military activities. If you imagine for a moment, some war starts in not South China Sea, but elsewhere. But interestingly, pirates are excluded. And then here are the following classes that are exempt from being attacked. And, this notion of hospital ships, I don't actually know whether there are such things, right, but I'm just putting it out there. Religious, non-military, small coastal ships, and I think more interestingly, small crafts. Because what we've seen is right now, there are a lot of people who like to play with small drones. I'm sure you've seen people flying around. You can buy one for $200. So you can imagine that in the future, when there's exponential technology, everyone who wants a mobile phone is going to want a mobile ship or a mobile drone for fun, not necessarily for anything big, But obviously then there are others who want to do it for leisure or maybe operate in business. These are the kind of things we need to think about as lawyers, because what I'm trying to say is right now, in this current state of mind, we are not prepared for this exponential growth of drones. And the reason why I'm saying this is I spent 2 months in Silicon Valley, and I can tell you right now that some of these startups, they have visions of sending thousands of these 2,000 to 6,000 unmanned drones to high sea, and I'm panicking. I'm sitting there going, what if there's a collision? What if something happens? What if someone dies? And obviously they're not asking these questions. So it's really our job to sort of think about these things, worst case scenarios or not worst case scenarios. So these are the kind of questions I'm throwing out there for your consideration. What's going to happen when we have a vision of unmanned shipping out there, be it military or being civilian or a combination of the two? We take into account piracy. How's that going to impact on it? Going back to the scenario that I showed you, where one state or one ship owner or one personnel grabs hold of a vessel and says, well, actually, that vessel is mine. How are we going to monitor this? Do we have a registration system like we have in aviation, or we don't? Or do they become just rubbish out in the seas? There are all these questions that we need to ask and we need to think about in terms of, well, how would we want to shape the future of shipping, and what role do we play as lawyers, policymakers and stakeholders? Because I did a speech, and I'm going to summarize, finish off, to big ship owners, Maersk, Rolls-Royce, on autonomous shipping. And when I mentioned the word transport systems, I can see their faces going white, because they're not thinking about transport systems. They're thinking of building their ship. I spoke to Koshipa and I said to them, who is going to build ships in the future? They have no idea. I said, think about it. Autonomous shipping is going to change the way we move. So truck drivers who are actually delivering the goods are going to master autonomous shipping, because once they master autonomous truck driving, the next place they're going to go is shipping. So they're going to disrupt the shipping industry. And the shipping industry is sitting there going, why is nothing happening here? And I'm like, by the time you figure it out, it's going to be too late. So I'm not being a cynic, I'm being an optimist, but I want people to look a little bit ahead in the next 50 years, as opposed to when is my next shipbuilding order coming in, because we need to be prepared for this exponential technology and how we can ensure shipping and safety in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tung, for your excellent presentation on the appropriate measures to